Welcome. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We may still have a few stragglers coming in because the weather is questionable today, but it's better tonight, and thank you all for coming out. I'm Shirley Decker, and I'm the director of Roots and Branches, and we're the ones who put on these seminars that many of you have come to. And this is Jenny Conley, and she's my assistant. I'm the director, and she's my assistant. And just for those of you who may be new, we think it's important to say just one or two things about Roots and Branches if you're not familiar with us. We are a small nonprofit organization whose mission it is to improve the environment in our community. And we do this through all of our year-round programs, and some of you may be familiar with them. If you've been downtown West Bend, you see our gardens all the way through the downtown area, and around town we have adopt-a-plot gardens. We have a cleanup in the spring of the parks and the green spaces, and we have an Arbor Day program where we help teach the kids in the schools about the importance of trees in our environment. We have a Mayor's Beautification Awards, Business Beautification Awards, garden tour, and I could go on, but that gives you an idea of what we do. And we're fortunate that we have an office here in City Hall, even though we're not part of the city, we're a nonprofit organization. But we do a lot with the city and for the city, and so they graciously give us this office and some of the support systems of being able to use this, this room, so we appreciate them. We hope that you might want to participate with us in the future as well, with other activities that we do. And you did get a brochure. Did they get a calendar too? The calendar, of course, is for this year. The new one will be coming out at the end of this year. But you can have an idea of what we do, and you may want to come along to the tour. You learn a lot on a tour to see what other people are growing in their gardens. So we hope to see you again. The seminars are always free and open to the public, but they're not free to us. We do have to raise money, and we raise money from individuals and businesses and foundations, and a couple of special events that we have during the year. And so we hope that, knowing that, you know that you're also needed to help us volunteer with all of our activities, because it's the volunteers that really keep us going. Thank you again for coming, and here's Jenny, and she's going to introduce our speaker.
So as she said, I'm Jenny Conley, and I'll be very brief. I'm sure you're anxious to hear from Glenn here. The first thing I'm going to do is pass around a clipboard. We'd like to know ideas that you'd like to hear about for future seminars. We're in works of always planning for next year, and we want to bring in speakers you guys want to hear. So that'll go around the room if you can just pass it all along. And without further ado, we'll introduce Glenn. He's a former professor of horticulture of Illinois at Horticulture at Illinois Central College. He was president of the Central Illinois Hosta Society, founder of the Illinois Central College Arboretum, and vice president of the American Conifer Society. So let's welcome Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming out this evening, pulling yourself away from the garden that you've been working in all day, I imagine, right?
Glenn, I think you can just use your wire. You have to use them both?
Have to use them both.
Oh, both.
Yeah. One is not the same as the other. Gotcha. Okay. So appreciate your being out here, and hopefully you'll get inspired this evening to get back out into your garden and do one of the tasks that is usually done in October, and that's plant bulbs. But first of all, we have to just figure out what is a bulb. Bulbs are not always bulbs, okay? We can use the generic term bulb, and we can use the true meaning of bulb. So a bulb actually has a lot of leaf tissue in it, but a lot of other things that we call bulbs are totally different. We've got tuberous roots that we sometimes call bulbs. We have corms that we sometimes call bulbs. These are mostly stem tissue, whereas a true bulb is mostly leaf tissue, like an onion. Doesn't look like a leaf, but it structurally is a leaf, okay? Rhizomes are sometimes called bulbs also. It's an underground structure, and basically anything that is a food storage organ we kind of refer to as a bulb. So whether it's a bulb, a corm, a tuberous root, a tuber like a potato, these are food storage organs. So the rest of the plant may be dormant, but then in the spring it comes to life and all parts of the plant then come from that storage organ. Okay, so there's actually a couple different types of true bulbs too. This is called an imbricate bulb, which is or a scaly bulb is another way of calling it, and that's the true lily, whereas the tunicate bulbs are like an onion, so where the leaf tissue is very close together. Here the leaf tissue pulls apart like scales. All right, so there's the scientific part of the talk. You can wake up now and we'll get on with the rest. All right, so planting tips. So when do you plant bulb? Right now. It's October. Believe it or not, it is October. And that's the best month to plant bulbs. Plant them in a well-drained site. Give it a little bit of fertilizer when you plant it, a balanced fertilizer like 10-10-10. Both at planting time and then as it's coming up in the spring. If you want a more natural fertilizer, you can use bone meal, which is phosphorus, and that helps the bulb get established. And it's best to plant in masses. A lot of times when you order bulbs, they come in groups of sometimes 50, 100, and that's when you get the best effect out of the bulb, especially with some of these smaller ones that we're going to talk about tonight. The rule of 3 is the thing you can use for planting depth. 3 times the height of the bulb is the approximate depth of planting. So if you measure your bulb and it's 1 inch long, then you should plant it at about 3 inches. And this is kind of a general idea. Generally, the bigger the bulb, obviously, the deeper it should be planted. So some of your larger alliums or daffodils or tulips should be down in the 6-7 inch range, whereas things like a smaller allium or crocus, those would be much closer to the ground.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
What would happen if you, say you had one that should have been 6 inches, but you planted it at 3? What would go wrong with it?
It probably, okay, the question is if you don't plant a bigger bulb deep enough, what's going to happen? Probably nothing in the first year or so, but it may kind of run out of steam after a while. You know, it may not persist from year to year. Okay. 2 different styles, formal and informal, asymmetric or symmetric, depends on the site, okay? So if you have a real formal setting in your garden, then maybe put your bulbs in a formal setting, whereas informal is best in most gardens. That's typically what I prefer with my bulbs. Sometimes you can mix bulbs with other types of plants, like daylilies and daffodils. You know, those of you who have grown daffodils know that the foliage, after it's done blooming, kind of is a liability in the garden. So what you're trying to do here is to plant it with something that's going to hide that foliage. And daylilies have a similar type of foliage, and that helps to hide the foliage of the daffodils. Some people will braid their foliage or tie it in knots. That kind of defeats the purpose of it, because what you want to do is have that foliage open to sunlight, which rebuilds that bulb. You need to have photosynthesis taking place. So the bigger area you have exposed to the sun, the better for persisting year after year. Okay, here's just an informal setting. This was in our home when we lived in Peoria, Illinois. We escaped that place about 8 years ago. Came back to my wife's sitting up front here, so if you hear somebody's heckling, that's who it is. Anyway, we're both from Wisconsin, so we're not Illinoisans by any means. All right, another informal type of setting. Now, we'll get back to this one that's called Scylla later on, but this is basically our neighbor's yard. But by the time we moved out, that Scylla had spread to half of our yard. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's go through some of these bulbs that you may or may not have used in the past, and hopefully it will get you inspired to use them in the future. I think one of the best bulbs and one of the more versatile bulbs to use are alliums, or ornamental onions. They range in size from real small and early blooming, 6 inches or so, to giant plants that are almost as tall as I am. And it is a true bulb, planted in full sun and well-drained soil, preferably late October. One thing you may not have known about an allium is that it actually makes a very good cut flower. And that's true of both the smaller ones and the bigger ones. And this is very important for some of us, it's deer-proof. Deer don't mess with allium. If you have deer in your yard, don't plant tulips. It's like candy. And they don't have any inhibitions to eating candy. Okay. So a lot of different types of allium. This is kind of an intermediate-sized one, the Star of Persia, Allium crostata, 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. A little bit later blooming than some of the shorter ones. This comes up in June with these star-like flowers in large clusters. Very nice plant. Allium giganteum, we've all seen that. It's very tall. It can be 4, maybe 5 feet tall at times. The foliage is nothing spectacular, so plant it somewhere where the foliage is going to be hidden or covered up by other plants that come up a little later. All right? So, if you've ever seen like a meadow with giant alliums growing in it, the place that comes to mind is the Green Bay Botanic Garden. They have a great use of allium there. Just gorgeous plant. One of the smallest and one of the earliest to bloom is the lily leek, very small plant called Allium molly. Maybe up to 12 inches tall, maybe it doesn't get that tall. So very small plant, it makes a real nice small bouquet. And a lot of these plants will naturalize too, so leave them in place and they'll continue to spread. Not necessarily aggressively, but spread enough that you'll get a little bit of a colony. Allium oreophyllum is called the alpine rose bells. Another nice intermediate-sized plant, about 12 inches tall. This one's a little different than the other one. It's the Allium senescens glaucum, or German garlic. This has evergreen foliage and blooms in late summer, or even into September. So whereas most of your alliums will bloom early, this one blooms later. Good rock garden plant, forms a nice clump. We've got the scissors in the. Yes. Okay. All right. So that's in our little rock garden that we have.
Excuse me. Do you still plant that at the same time, though?
Yes. Still planted at the same time.
Do anything.
Right. Foliage will come up through the summer, and then the flowers in the fall. Some of the early blooming alliums, by the way, the foliage will die down in the spring or into the summer. So the later blooming ones, the foliage will hang around though. Now, one to avoid is this one, Allium tuberosum, called garlic chives, because unless you really like garlic, this one will produce way more than you need. It can be very invasive with the seeds. So stay away from it. And, same thing, chives. I don't have chives up there, the true chives, but that one can also become very invasive. Okay, yes, ma'am.
How much sun do these alliums
Full sun,
plant?
full sun. The more the better. Yep.
And it's a perennial, it comes back?
It'll come back year after year.
Take it out.
If you give it a well-drained site in full sun, it'll come back better year after year.
Okay.
Yep.
And that garlic plant, is that the edible type of garlic that if you would want, you would grow?
You could. Yeah, there's different species that are used as garlic or chives, same thing, not same thing, but
But this is not.
this is
garlic.
not the garlic, right? No, okay. Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood you.
All right.
You're right, okay. Thank you. All right, moving on to anemone, Grecian windflower. This is a rhizome, which is an underground stem. So when you buy this one, you get little pieces that look like dried up material. All right? It doesn't look like much when you get it. Before you plant it, soak it for up to 24 hours. That'll help to hydrate it and get it going again. And blooms in early spring in April. The foliage will die down through the summer then. Again, this one should be in full sun, well-drained soil. In fact, I don't think I need even to say well-drained because I don't know of any bulbs that like wet feet. So every bulb should be well-drained soil. Okay, Camellia. Anybody grow Camellia? Yeah, we got a couple. It's not known very well, but the more we do have it. Yes. The more I look into this one and see ours in our yard, the better. I think it is. It has. When I first put this in, I just put a few bulbs in by our patio, and it has spread into a very nice colony now. Not overly aggressive, but enough to create a statement. This too is a true bulb. Gets maybe up to 2 feet tall, although ours hasn't reached that height. Blooming in, usually we think of May and June as mid to late spring, but in Wisconsin here it's like, okay, winter finally got out of here and we're finally into spring. Full sun, maybe a little bit of shade, part shade, be okay. So as this develops a colony, it gets better and better. I also have another one in, this is a species type of Camellia or quamash. I also have a variegated one, which I'm not nearly as impressed with. It just has not filled in like the green ones are. A lot of different Camellias. This is a species called Linii. A couple of cultivars, Blue Danube and Alba, which means white, although that's not really white. Yep.
On the previous picture, what is the species on the left?
Oh, God.
Or the variety, I should say.
Okay, off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
I know you're talking about full sun now. In the spring, when the trees haven't leafed out yet,
Mhm.
these things get a lot more sun than
Right.
they do. So can you go by full sun as in the springtime?
You can go by full sun in the spring, although if the tree leaves out fairly early, then that foliage won't get maybe as much sunshine as you'd like it to regenerate the bulb.
That's true. Would
Yeah.
fertilizing help, other than letting the leaves produce the food? Would fertilizing be a good
Alternative?
substitute? Yeah.
No, fertilizer and light are two different things. Yeah. Light allows the plant to produce its own food. Fertilizer are nutrients so that the plant can produce food. Okay, so they're mutually exclusive. All right, so several different types here. Here's a Sacagawea is a variegated one. That's not the one I have, but and then another species, Cusickii. Okay, so a lot of different chamasias for you to experiment with. Here's one of my favorites, Chianodoxa or Glory of the Snow. Again, it's a true bulb, only gets about 3 to 6 inches tall. Early spring plant, blue with a white center. This is a plant that you can allow to colonize, which it has done in our yard. It has spread from one area to another, and that's good. After it's done blooming, the foliage dies down, so you don't even know it's there. So you get an early spring show with this, but it's not going to be hanging around in the summer when you want other things to be your showcase. You could call that jack-in-the-box planting if you want. So you get different seasons of bloom in your garden, starting early, going into the late. So a little close-up here of the flowers. Foliage is fairly thin, and even before it totally dies down, it's not a nuisance. So great plant. Don't even think about planting less than 25 of them. All right, if you just plant 1 or 2 bulbs, it's just not going to show up. So plant it in masses, space them out. It will gradually fill in. Put this in, your regular planting beds mixed in with your other plants. Autumn crocus. We think of crocus as a spring blooming plant, and there is, which is the genus Crocus. Now this one is colchicum, but there is also an autumn blooming plant with the genus Crocus. Apparently Louise Wilder thought a lot of this plant because she wrote about it. And you can look that one up. All right, so this is a corm. Corms are stem tissue, if you remember from one of the first slides. Sometimes those corms look kind of dried up like the rhizomes do when you get those in the mail order. So again, just a little bit of soaking. You don't have to do it for 24 hours, but a little bit of soaking to help it hydrate will help it to get established in the fall. So the flowers come up in the fall. The leaves appear early in the spring and then kind of die back. So it's almost like you have nothing there in the summer, and then all of a sudden the flowers come up in the fall. So great plant. The only drawback to colchicum is it's very expensive for some reason. I'm not sure why. But you can get autumn flowering crocus, which is a lot cheaper and, in my opinion, looks just as good. Several different varieties. This is one a species called speciosum. Again, different types of colchicums. Now, here's the true crocus, also a corm. Small, this is the giant crocus that we're looking at here, sometimes called crocus hybrids. But there are different species of crocus that you can get as well, some of which bloom earlier than this. Actually, low fertility is good, so don't fertilize this one. If you do, it tends to get a little bit leggy and tends to flop over. So that's the reason you don't want to fertilize this. Again, a great massing plant. The hybrid crocus comes in a variety of colors. And then there are these species which you can get which are just one color if you wish. Crocus chrysanthus, anserensis, different cultivars of those species. And you can see that even some of them are smaller like that, Crocus anserensis. So very early blooming. In fact, the first thing to come up in our yard is this, which I didn't plant, but I didn't tear it out either when we moved in because it's just a gorgeous little plant. I just wish I knew what cultivar it was. Sometimes late, look at, are we under air raid or something? Flood watch, okay. All right. All right, so sometimes it'll bloom and then you'll get some ice and snow that comes after the blooms. But, you know, it just kind of hangs in there, and then as soon as the sun comes out, get a little more warmth, those flowers will open up again. And crocus works great as a companion plant to holly, too. A couple years ago, obviously. All right. All right, another early blooming one is Aranthus or winter aconite. And this too may come up through the snow or you know, maybe blooming in the snow if you get a late spring snow. Very low growing, yellow flowers. The foliage kind of hangs around for a while, but is not what I'd call an obstruction to the garden. It looks like a buttercup. In fact, it's in the buttercup family. We put probably, I don't know, 25 of these in 5 years ago or so. And in the last couple of years, it is really colonizing nicely. So great plant for massing or naturalizing, and again, mixing in with your other plants because the foliage will die down and you know, it'll sleep until spring. You can see here that the foliage actually kind of elongates and spreads out after the flowers are gone. Very interesting umbrella-like foliage, or fern, whatever you want to call it. If it's an umbrella, I guess the rain would kind of get through there, wouldn't it? All right. So another great colonizing plant that everybody should have this in their yard. Fritillarias, there's a number of different fritillarias. Again, variety of sizes. The big one is this one, Larrya Imperialis. Now, a word of warning, do not plant this one right next to a window where the breeze might be coming in the spring, or next to your patio where you may be going out early in the spring because it smells like a skunk. All right, so, you know, it's a very pretty plant, but it stinks. It's putting it mildly, it does. Now, this is the first, what we call an imbricate bulb or scaly bulb. And one problem this can have is those scales can trap moisture as it's moving through the soil and cause the bulb to rot. So a recommendation with this is that you plant it on its side, okay? And maybe even put something really well drained right underneath the bulb, like a layer of sand or something to get the water to go through. The plant will figure out which way is up and which way is down. So you don't have to worry about the flower growing downward if you plant it on its side. It'll, you know, through hormonal control, come up. And it'll help to keep the moisture off the bulb. So this is Larrya Imperialis, the crown imperial, or different cultivars are either red or yellow, Ludia, yellow one. So very nice plant. There's also...
Does it deter the deer because it stinks?
Probably. I don't know for sure, but you know, I've never seen deer go after it. But that's one of the bulbs you just don't see used very much. This one's used a little more often, the checkered lily, Fritillaria meleagris. In fact, we got some in the mail yesterday to plant some more in our yard. Only grows maybe a foot tall. Let's see. Also a scaly bulb, but much smaller. So you don't have to worry too much about this one trapping moisture. And you can get a white variety of it as well. So now what happens with Fritillaria meleagris, after it's done blooming, the foliage will actually elongate some. and then eventually will die down. So both of these the foliage will die down. Another one that we had in our Peoria garden, but I don't have here yet, is Larrya Imperialis. Good German name, right? All right. Only grows about 8 inches tall. Very nice looking flowers. So again, it planted in groups and masses, and it'll look more impressive. Snowdrops are one of the first bulbs to come up in the spring. Like the glory of the snow, it makes a great colonizer. Planted in masses. You know, some people, well, actually, let me go back here to that glory of the snow that I talked about earlier. That was colonizing when we lived in Peoria. And actually, they were coming up in the grass, in the lawn. It was seeding itself in the lawn, which was just fine because usually it's dying down by the time you're mowing lawn, even in Peoria, which is a lot earlier than here in Ozaukee County, or here in Washington County. Okay. But you get the lake effect, and that really messes things up. So this will do the same thing. You could put it, either plant it in your yard, or if it comes up in your yard, let it go. It's a great plant. But again, use it in masses. 1 or 2 is not going to be very effective. Wood hyacinth, Hyacinthoides hispanica. I think it's a good plant. It'll take a little more shade than some of the other bulbs. That's why it's called the wood hyacinth. I had great plans for this in our yard in Cedarburg here. Planted a nice grouping of it. Foliage came up great in the spring. Just before it was ready to start blooming in late May, I think we had a deer that came running through the backyard and nibbled this thing down. 2 years in a row now, it's nibbled it down to nothing. So we've had no flowers on it. So I think next year I may have to use some kind of deer deterrent of some sort to keep the deer off of that, because otherwise it's just not going to bloom. But again, good colonizer. The foliage on this, though, will not die down. All right? It may get eaten down, but it won't die down on its own. So, plant it somewhere where the foliage is not a liability. Actually, it isn't a liability anyway. It almost looks like a grass after the flowers are gone. A couple of irises are bulbs. Most irises are rhizomes along the ground, but there are a couple that are bulbs, and the Danford iris is one of them. Close cousin to this next one, which is Iris reticulata, or the netted iris. So both of them are in that 6-inch range or so. The big difference between them, besides their name, is the color of the flower. The culture is the same. You plant them, maybe at like 3 to 4 inches deep, and they come up at about the same time. Now go to this side. After the flower is done, you can see the leaf is going upright. It will elongate to probably a foot and a half long. But it's so thin, you don't even see that it's there. So again, it's not a liability. And eventually that too will die down as the summer goes on. So nice plant, as is Iris reticulata. This one is a little more readily available. The Danfordii, you'd probably have to get mail order. To get it, you have to mail order it. Iris crostata, crested iris. It's not a true bulb. It's not a bulb at all. It's a rhizome. This, like other irises, this is a rhizome. But I thought I'd throw it in because it is a early blooming plant. And very nice. If you haven't grown the Iris crostata, get it. It's just a beautiful little flower. gradually spreads, forming a clump. You can see that this one, okay, you can see the clump here. Now, that's in our garden, and I think we've had that in for 3 or 4 years now. So it's colonizing nicely. Go ahead, Jim.
Do you happen to know if this is jugloan tolerant?
Jugloan tolerant.
This one.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. We actually did have a butternut not too far from this plant, which also has jugloan, so I would say it's fine. We had it removed like 3 years ago because it was rotting out, but the jugloan would probably still be in the ground, the roots. Yeah, yeah.
The juggle was in the black walnut.
Black walnuts, yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think most of these bulbs are pretty jugloan tolerant. Again, I haven't tried them, but I haven't really read anything that bulbs are sensitive to jugloan.
What is juggle?
Jugloan is a material produced by members of the walnut genus, which you've heard of. You can't grow things underneath a walnut. That's because of this material that's produced on the plant, and it's produced in all parts of the plant: the roots, the stems, the leaves, the fruit. Everything has that jugloan, and it is a material that will inhibit certain types of plants. Okay. Closely related to the crested iris is this one, which is Iris lacustris, which is native to areas around the Great Lakes. In Wisconsin, it's on the protected list of plants, and that's because it is only found up around the Great Lakes, up in Door County. If you've ever been up in Door County in May, you've probably seen this plant. But otherwise, very similar to the crested iris. Crested iris maybe has slightly larger flowers than the dwarf lake iris. You won't be able to buy this one, right? Because it is an endangered plant. Just thought I'd throw it in there. All right, leucojum or snowflake. There's a couple different types of leucojum. There's the summer snowflake and the spring snowflake, and that tells you when it blooms. The spring snowflake is a little bit earlier, blooming in March and April. The summer snowflake, May and June. And around here it probably is more like late June when summer comes. It's a taller plant. The summer snowflake will be up around a foot tall. The spring snowflake generally is a little bit shorter. Both of them have this real nice bell shape to them with the green dot on the petal. And you can see it forms a nice colony as well. The foliage will persist, so put it somewhere where other plants can sort of take over for it in the summer. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on lilies, but I definitely want to tell you a little bit about the martagon lilies. If you haven't grown a martagon lily, you should. All right, they are gorgeous plants. They always have the petals kind of recessed and flower hanging down. This will grow in sun or fairly heavy shade. We've got some underneath some Norway maples in our front yard. We also have some on our perennial border where it's almost full sun. Both will bloom. The one in full sun is colonizing a little bit quicker, however, and that makes sense because it's got more sunlight. It's one of the best northern lilies. Okay, this one, if you were down south, you probably wouldn't even try to grow this. They do not like a lot of heat, but they do like the cooler regions of the upper Midwest. Great plants. You don't have to stake them. This person did.
They stand up, they're
Yeah.
beautiful.
Okay.
They just,
Take it from my wife. She's always right.
I know.
How tall do they get?
They can get about 4 feet tall.
Almost as tall as me.
Well, she's 5, but but they don't quite get that tall. But they're a good 4 feet tall.
And they
And
never
can you get-
flop, they never have
They
flopped.
won't flop, that's good to know. Can you get them at the stores, or do you have to order them?
I have ordered them. I have seen them at some garden centers, but not around here.
Oh, okay.
You know, I don't know why, but
I'm gonna check it out.
tell one of your sponsors to get on the stick here. Right? All right, here's actually the one on our sunny border.
Oh, they're just,
Those are not our meatball ewes in the background. Those are the neighbors. All right, I mean, this one is a different species, but it's in the same group of lilies as the martagons and Tsingtaoense. I love that name too. It just rolls off your tongue. The Tsingtao lily. This one we have underneath a honey locust in our front yard, where my wife can look at it from her little writing room and get inspired.
it's the
It's
orangest
gorgeous
orange.
plant.
It's
Just-
the orangest orange you could ever imagine.
Yep. Gorgeous plant, really is.
You don't have that one on here, do you?
I think that's a late addition. I'll put it back so you can write it down. Tsingtaoense.
How tall does that get?
4 feet. Yeah, it's pretty close to 4 feet, 3 to 4, I'd say.
And on the darkest, dreariest, ugliest day, when that thing is in bloom and you look out the window, it's like a light. It just glows. It's,
And when do they start to bloom?
May.
They do?
Yeah, do I have that up? No, I don't have that. I think it's in May or June. June, probably, yeah, June, more like June.
And then do they stay flowering, or do you have to pinch them back, or?
You just let them go. You don't have to do anything with them. It'll continue to bloom probably 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now, lilies as a group, I mean, if you select the right lilies, you can get them blooming from, well, some of these martagons are some of the earliest, to this one, which was blooming for us yesterday, I think. Yeah, it's still blooming in our yard. The Speciosum album, probably the latest one I have for bloom. So, and another great thing about lilies, you can plant them amongst all your other perennials or annuals because they find a place to grow. They don't need a lot of room. They'll just come up and be over the top of your other plants. So we're continuing to get lilies and adding them to our garden because, they're just great. And then there's the magic lily or surprise lily. This one's been around for a long time. Actually, it kind of has fallen out of favor. You don't see too many people planting this anymore. It is still available, but where you'll see it is in older landscapes where your grandmother might have planted it. Anybody have it yet? Okay. All right. And it's still blooming or not quite? Finished blooming?
I haven't looked at it this year yet because it's kind of getting overgrown by a tree.
Oh,
But it was,
okay.
we all thought it was, yeah, just
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago this was in bloom for sure. But it's kind of like that colchicum. The foliage comes up in the spring, then dies down, and you think, oh, lost that one. And then all of a sudden, surprise, there it is. Hence the name surprise lily.
We used to call it the holy lily. I don't know why.
That was one we had
Isn't that the one
in
they
Creve
call
Coeur.
the bare naked lady too?
I don't know, we used to call
Heard
it
that called the bare naked lady because it has no leaves.
Yeah, okay, I'm trying to keep it politically correct here.
I could be a different plant too.
Yeah, I think you're right. All right, muscari or grape hyacinth, very fragrant plant. Again, planted in colonies, so you can get a full effect of that fragrance. true bulb, blooming in late spring, April into June. Full sun, part shade, similar to some of the other small bulbs. So right now, I mean, the ones that we've got in our yard, the new foliage is coming up right now. Okay, and then it'll bloom next spring, and then the foliage kind of dies off in the summer. It doesn't totally die off, but I've got it in an area where I don't care. It can do whatever it wants. So it's not a real high visibility area. So mix this in, maybe put it in a rock garden. That would be a good place for it. Or as a border plant, something like that. There are a lot of different types of muscaris, different colors. You can get some really exotic ones. Macrocarpum golden fragrance, Valerie finis. White ones, blue ones. Okay, a later blooming one is called latifolium. A little bit later blooming than some of the others. So a lot of different ones out there. If you go online and find some specialty nurseries for bulbs, you can get quite a variety of a lot of these different bulbs. All right, I'm not going to spend much time on daffodils, but just mention a couple of species daffodils. Some of those that aren't used very often. This one is Narcissus asturiensis, very early blooming, a low-growing plant, maybe 6 inches tall. Some of these early ones, the smaller ones, the foliage will tend to die down quicker than your larger daffodils. So it's not a liability in the landscape by any means. Petticoat daffodil, bulbicodiums, a lot of different variety within that species, but they're all low-growing plants, bloom early, and then the foliage dies down. Caniculatus is a cultivar of the species Tezetta. So again, a lower-growing plant. So look at some of these more unusual daffodils. Deer usually don't mess with daffodils, so if you have a deer issue, plant daffodils.
What about the bunnies?
I haven't had any problems with daffodil foliage, no. All right, another low-growing plant, Pushkinia, striped squill, great plant. I probably like this one second to that Glory of the Snow, which we looked at earlier. The foliage on this is a little bit coarser, hangs around a little bit longer, but again, I don't consider it a major liability. It tends to colonize, it'll spread, about 6 inches tall, blooming mainly in March and April. And you can see it does colonize quite nicely. I think this was our garden in Peoria where it was spreading very well. You can see the flower is mostly white with this thin blue stripe down the petal. Yes, Scylla. You love it or you hate it. Those who have it probably hate it. Those who look at the pictures think, wow, I got to get some of those. Well, I can get you some for free. Scylla, Siberian squill. It's a great looking plant. It colonizes. It colonizes. It colonizes. So that's the advantage, and it's the disadvantage. So, and if you have it, and you think, oh, I wish I didn't have that, you're not going to get rid of it. I know somebody who sells hostas in Cedarburg who has it all over his yard. He has tried burning it down, chemically killing it off. Nothing works. if you have it like that, you just have to learn to love it because, it's just not going to go away. All right, so this was our Peoria home. We didn't have it in our yard. The neighbor had it in their yard. But we were there, 20 years or something like that. It had spread probably 15, 20 feet into our yard during that time. So,
How long is it in bloom?
Oh, 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Right.
so you learn to love it and then.
Yeah, and then for 6 months until the foliage dies down, you don't like.
These than the wild violets.
Yeah, well, at least with wild violet, you have a half a chance of digging out the individual plants,
Which we did.
which I still am doing. With this, though, you just aren't going to do it because, the way these bulbs reproduce on their own is they form bulblets or bulbils, which start out very tiny, almost microscopic, and then gradually get bigger. So you dig them, you dig these out and you think, oh, wow, I'm getting rid of these things. Well, then the next year, you look in that area and you've got all these thin leaf coming up, which won't bloom that first year, but gradually they get bigger and bigger, and they continue, and then they will bloom. So you just can't get rid of it. We had chives in our yard when we first moved in here in Cedarburg 8 years ago. We still have chives. We're finding chives. You just can't get rid of it. All right. So anyway, on to something bigger and better, which probably most of you, if not all of you, have never heard of, and that's called Tritelia. It's a June blooming plant. Gorgeous flowers, blue and white flowers, up to, I think ours are, foot and a half tall, something like that. And, after bloom, my wife will say the foliage is a liability. I think it's not, because other things are covering it up that are growing in that area. But, some like it, some
I'm
don't.
beginning to like it.
Okay.
It's massing quite nicely.
Yeah, it is forming a nice colony in the area where we've got it. So a great plant. I think it's a good one to add to your bulb collection. A couple of species tulips, Kaufman tulips tend to be, all these tulips tend to be smaller. The ones I'm going to talk about are smaller than the typical tulips that you may be familiar with. Kaufmanniana is called the water lily tulip. Again, deer love tulip. It doesn't matter whether it's a hybrid or a species, they're going to eat it. So be aware of that. Some of these tulips, some of the larger tulips tend to kind of deteriorate over time. If you get 3 or 4 years out of some of the bigger tulips, you're doing pretty well. The species tulips, if you have them in the right spot, will tend to colonize. So that's an advantage, I think. So Kaufmanniana, Gregii, all of these are nice species tulips. This one called Red Riding Hood. Orange Emperor. And you can see the foliage also is attractive. It has kind of stripes in it. Foster tulips are a cross between the grape tulips and the Kaufman tulips. So very similar to the other two that we looked at. There's Oriental Splendor. So you can see the foliage really is quite attractive on some of these species tulips. And a couple others, but Batalinii, I kind of like the foliage on that one. Linifolia, Tarda. So all these are very nice species tulips. So think about using some of those rather than your hybrid tulips. So, that's not our house. But if you've ever been in Cedarburg, which I assume most of you have, you've seen that. That one is our house. I write an article, a monthly article for the News Graphic, which I have now, and now I'm putting it in, all those articles I've been writing for 8 years, I've been putting them into a blog. So if you have nothing to do this winter, absolutely nothing, and you want to read about 75 articles that I've written on a variety of topics, anything dealing with plants, you can go to the Cottage Gardener 53012.wordpress.com. And, yeah. Yes, ma'am?
Can any of these spring bulbs be put into pots rather than?
Absolutely, they all could be.
Oh, they could. And
But they aren't going to overwinter in that pot.
so where would you put them? I mean,
In the winter, if you're going to use them in a pot in the spring,
right.
I would probably then plant it into your garden after bloom. Or maybe let the foliage die down, then plant it when it's dormant. Another possibility, I haven't tried it, so, but off the top of my head I think it would work, is you could dig up those, after it's done in the pot, dig up the bulbs, or just leave them in there, I guess, and kind of leave them dry and dormant. And then they will need a vernalization period. They'll need cool temperatures for, it could be, depending on what kind of bulb it is, it could be anywhere from a month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, where it actually is, say, at around the 32 degrees. So it produces roots, and then it'll come up again in the spring.
So you could actually do that whole process in a pot?
You could, yes.
Soil the bulbs, and, because I don't have a lot of, I live in a condo.
Okay.
So I'm a little
But
tight on garden space.
But the problem is, where are you going to put it in the winter?
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
How big is your refrigerator?
What about the garage?
If the garage is like attached
Yeah.
and it doesn't get extremely cold, yeah, you could do that.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
and then just take it out in the spring.
Right.
And, well, that's
Right.
what I'm gonna try.
Try it.
Yeah.
What have you got to lose, right?
Could you put it in a bucket of, the bulbs in a bucket of sand to kind of help insulate it then?
While they're in the pot?
No, if you, once
Take
you
the-
take the
take the-
bulbs out of the pot, if you had like a 6-gallon pail, fill it with sand and then put your bulbs in there and put more sand on the top to kind of insulate it,
And then what?
and then put it in your garage for the winter.
Okay. See, what a bulb does over winter, and the reason you plant in October is so that it can put down roots. And you can do that, but it's not going to last very long.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you could take some bulbs that you forgot to plant in the fall, and you found them in your garage. You could plant them in the spring, and you'd get some flowers, but it wouldn't be nearly as big. Okay. And, whether it'll persistent beyond that year is,
So
another
It
question.
would be better just to leave them in a pot of dirt.
And then, yeah, and so it can put down roots in that pot.
And any kind of garden soil?
Or better than that would be potting soil. Garden soils in a pot tend to get very heavy, hold a lot of moisture. You don't want to do that. So it has to be well drained. Yep.
I have some lilies of the valley that I'd like to,
Get rid of?
when
You weren't out there today? Yeah, I'd say anytime you get the urge. Yeah, lily of the valley, I mean, yeah, it's a nice plant when it's in bloom, but you know, that's kind of like the scilla, except it's easier to get rid of lily of the valley than scilla. We've done it.
I couldn't keep mine. I wanted lily
Wow.
of the valley because my mom always had it. Yeah.
In the shade, well drained in the shade?
Yeah, and it just, I mean, I'd get a couple little and then all of a sudden it just disappeared.
Wow. What color is your thumb?
It must be brown.
Any other questions? Yes.
Is there anything you can do, you said the tulips die out after 3 or 4 years, is there anything you can do to keep them going?
Yeah. After they're done blooming, cut the spent flowers off, leave the foliage, let it die down naturally, fertilize it. Yeah,
That'll keep them a little longer.
longer, yeah. Mhm. Thank you very much. Oh. All right, go.
The bulbs where you said they're for cut flowers.
Alliums.
Yeah, so that means if you cut them, just the leaves are what regenerates the bulb.
Right,
So you can cut, okay,
yeah.
okay. Sorry.
Okay, now you can apply. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, thank you guys all very much for coming. Hope you come to our next one on November 5th, holiday decorating tips and tricks with Tina Lutz with the Wreath Factory. So, thank you so much.